Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The evening of February 4, 1974, was supposed to be unremarkable. In Berkeley, California, the cool night air carried the scent of eucalyptus and the distant hum of city life. Inside apartment 4 at 2603 Benvenue Avenue, a 19-year-old university student named Patricia Campbell Hearst was relaxing with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. The light was soft. The mood was quiet. They were a world away from the turmoil that defined the era, insulated by the privilege that came with being the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the legendary and immensely powerful newspaper magnate. Their life was one of academic pursuits, future plans, and the gentle certainty that comes with old money. But certainty is a fragile thing. And on that quiet Monday night, the outside world, a world of radical politics, violent ideology, and desperate rage, was about to kick their door in. It began with a knock. A young woman's voice claimed she'd been in a car accident and needed to use their phone. Stephen Weed, cautious, cracked the door open only slightly. In that instant, the quiet evening shattered into a nightmare of splintering wood, shouted commands, and the cold, unmistakable feel of gun barrels pressed against skin. 3 armed figures, 2 black men and a white woman, stormed into the apartment. Weed was brutally beaten, knocked unconscious. Patty, clad only in a bathrobe, was dragged kicking and screaming out of the sanctuary of her home, out into the darkness. She was bound, blindfolded, and thrown into the trunk of a waiting car. As the engine roared to life and the car sped away, the scent of eucalyptus was replaced by the smell of gasoline and fear. The last thing she heard from her old life was the fading sound of her own screams, swallowed by the indifferent Berkeley night. The kidnapping of a Hearst was, on its own, a sensational story. But what unfolded in the weeks and months that followed would become something far more complex, more disturbing and more enduring. It would become a story, not just about a crime, but about the very nature of identity, will, and survival. The woman who was taken that night would, in a way, cease to exist. In her place would emerge someone else entirely. A revolutionary soldier named Tania, photographed holding a carbine in front of a militant flag, her voice broadcast across the nation denouncing her family as the Pig Hearsts and pledging her life to the very people who had stolen it. The world was left to ask a question that still echoes today. Was she a brainwashed victim, a terrified puppet mouthing the words of her captors to stay alive, or was she a willing convert, an heiress who shed her life of privilege to embrace a violent cause? The answer lies buried in one of the most controversial and fascinating psychological phenomena ever to enter the public lexicon. Today, we dissect the anatomy of Stockholm Syndrome through the To understand the Symbionese Liberation Army, the group that shattered Patty Hearst's life, you must first understand the atmosphere of the early 1970s. America was a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. The Vietnam War raged on, fueling a massive and often violent anti-war movement. The idealism of the 60s had curdled into the cynicism and paranoia of the 70s. Stoked by the Watergate scandal, in the cities, movements for civil rights and black power were challenging the foundations of American society. Groups like the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground advocated for armed struggle against what they saw as a racist, imperialist state. It was a time of bombings, of political assassinations, of a deep and bitter cultural divide. Out of this chaotic political primordial soup, the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, crawled into existence. They were, by any measure, a fringe group even by the standards of the radical left. Their name itself was a bizarre piece of revolutionary jargon. Symbionese was a word invented by their leader, intended to describe a symbiotic relationship between different classes and races united in revolution. Their symbol was a 7-headed cobra, each head representing a principle of their convoluted ideology, a mix of black nationalism, Maoism, and quasi-feminist rhetoric they called Kwanzaa. The reality was far less grand. The SLA was a tiny, isolated cell of no more than a dozen members, a collection of white, middle-class radicals and ex-convicts, all held in the thrall of one man, Donald DeFreeze. DeFreeze was a career criminal who had escaped from Soledad prison in 1973. He adopted the name General Field Marshal Shinku Tume, Shinku, after the leader of the Amistad slave rebellion. He was a charismatic, manipulative, and deeply paranoid figure who saw himself as the leader of a coming black revolution. He gathered a small following of disillusioned students and activists, many of whom he had met through his involvement with a prison outreach program at Berkeley. His core group included individuals like Nancy Ling Perry, a former conservative-turned-radical, Angela Atwood, a former actress, and the married couple William and Emily Heiress, who had been middle-class schoolteachers before falling into Shinku's orbit. They were, for the most part, educated people, searching for meaning in a world they had come to despise, and in Shinku they found a leader who gave their anger a voice and a purpose, however diluted. The SLA announced their existence to the world in November of 1973 with an act of shocking violence. They assassinated Marcus Foster, the first black superintendent of schools in Oakland, California. Their justification was that Foster was a fascist for supporting a plan to issue identification cards to students. The reality was that they had misread the political landscape entirely. Foster was a beloved and respected community leader. His murder alienated the very people the SLA claimed to be liberating, branding them not as revolutionaries, but as senseless killers in the eyes of the Bay Area's black and leftist communities. The assassination also put them on the FBI's radar. 2 members were arrested, and the remaining group, led by Shinku, knew they needed a drastic move to regain relevance and secure a bargaining chip for their imprisoned comrades. They needed a high-profile target. They needed a symbol of the establishment they so viciously hated. They needed a Hearst. The choice of Patty was both strategic and symbolic. As the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, she was American royalty. The Hearst Corporation was a sprawling media empire, the very definition of capitalist power. To the SLA, kidnapping her was an act of war against the corporate state. It would guarantee them headlines, a platform for their manifesto, and a powerful lever to exert their will. They conducted surveillance on the Hearst family, but found the family's heavily guarded mansion in Hillsborough impenetrable. So they turned their attention to the family's perceived weak link, the 19-year-old student living a relatively normal life in a Berkeley apartment. In the first hours and days after she was torn from her home, Patty Hearst ceased to be a person. She became an object, a thing to be controlled. Blindfolded and gagged, she was thrown into a small dark closet, barely 24 inches wide and 6 feet long. This cramped pitch-black space would be her entire world for the next 57 days. She was let out only for brief blindfolded bathroom breaks. Food was sparse. Sleep was impossible, interrupted by the constant haranguing voices of her captors. They were relentlessly drilling their ideology into her, a non-stop barrage of political rhetoric, revolutionary theory, and venomous hatred for her family and the class she represented. Chinku de Vries was the conductor of this psychological orchestra. His voice, a mix of messianic certainty and menacing authority, was a constant presence. He told her she was a prisoner of war, captured in the name of the oppressed. He told her that her father was a corporate fascist, and that her life of privilege was built on the suffering of the masses. He and the others lectured her for hours on end about the evils of American imperialism, racism, and sexism. They forced her to read their political tracts, to memorize their slogans, to understand the world through their warped, violent lens. It was a process of systematic deconstruction. Every pillar of her identity, her family, her education, her social standing, her future, was methodically torn down and labeled as corrupt, decadent, and worthy only of destruction. Meanwhile, the SLA began communicating with the outside world. They sent a communique to a local radio station, announcing they had taken Patty Hearst as a prisoner of war and demanding the release of their 2 jailed members. When that demand was rejected, they shifted tactics. Their new demand was far more audacious. Designed as a grand act of political theater, they ordered Randolph Hearst to finance a massive food giveaway program for the poor of California, a program they called People in Need. They demanded he provide $70 worth of high-quality food to every needy person in the state, a cost that would have run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Randolph Hearst, desperate to get his daughter back, tried to comply. He announced the creation of the People in Need program with an initial $2 million contribution of his own money. The result was chaos. The distribution points were swamped. Riots broke out as desperate crowds fought over limited supplies of groceries. The SLA, watching the spectacle unfold, was furious. They called it a meager effort, a publicity stunt. On a new audio tape they released to the press, Patty's voice was heard for the first time. It was flat, emotionless, a monotone recitation of her captor's words. She criticized her parents' efforts, stating that the food distribution was inadequate and that she feared her captors were losing patience. To her frantic parents and to the FBI, it sounded like a script read under duress. But it was the first sign that the woman in the closet was beginning to change. The psychological concept we now call Stockholm Syndrome had not yet fully entered the public consciousness in 1974. Its name came from a specific event that had occurred just months earlier, in August 1973, in Stockholm, Sweden. 4 bank employees were held hostage for 6 days inside a bank vault by a lone robber named Jan-Erik Olsson. During the prolonged ordeal, a strange and powerful bond formed between the captives and their captor. They began to fear the police outside more than the man holding them hostage. When the police finally drilled a hole into the vault, one of the hostages, Kristen and Mark, famously telephoned the Swedish Prime Minister and pleaded with him to let the robber take her and another hostage with him in a getaway car. She told him she trusted her captor completely and was terrified of the police rescue effort. After their rescue, the hostages continued to defend Olsson, refusing to testify against him and even raising money for his legal defense. Psychiatrists and law enforcement were baffled. A criminologist named Nils Bajero was brought in to analyze the case, and he coined the term Norrmalmstorg-syndromet, or Stockholm Syndrome. To describe this paradoxical psychological response, he theorized that under conditions of extreme duress, isolation, and a perceived threat to one's life, a victim can develop a powerful, albeit irrational bond with their captor as a survival mechanism. This phenomenon, often referred to as capture bonding, is not a formal psychiatric diagnosis listed in the DSM-5, but is widely recognized as a potential response to trauma. It's built on a foundation of several key elements. First, there is the overwhelming threat to survival. The victim is entirely dependent on the captor for their very life. Every breath they take is at the whim of the person holding the gun. This creates a state of infantile regression, where the victim, like a newborn, becomes completely reliant on their caregiver for food, safety, and life itself. In Patty's case, she was not just threatened. She was told repeatedly that the SLA's War Council was debating whether to execute her. Her life hung by a thread, and machine-gun-toting held the scissors. Second, the victim experiences small acts of kindness from the captor within a context of terror. Being given a glass of water, being allowed to use the bathroom, or even just being spoken to without aggression can be perceived by a terrified and disoriented mind as profound acts of mercy. These minor kindnesses create a sense of gratitude and can begin to warp the victim's perception. The captor ceases to be a monster and becomes a complex human being, someone capable of both cruelty and compassion. Patty would later describe how, after weeks in the closet, being allowed to sit at a table with the group, even blindfolded, felt like an incredible privilege. Third, there is isolation from outside perspectives. The victim is sealed off from friends, family, and any viewpoint that contradicts the captor's narrative. The captor's voice becomes the only voice, their version of reality, the only reality. For 57 days, Patty Hearst's only human contact was with the SLA. Their ideology was not just an opinion, it was the air she breathed. Her old world, with its nuances and complexities, faded into a distant memory, replaced by the stark black-and-white certainty of the SLA's worldview. Finally, there is the perceived inability to escape. When a victim believes escape is impossible, their survival instinct may pivot from resistance to appeasement and identification. To survive, they must see the world from the captor's point of view, anticipate their needs, and align with their goals. It's a desperate strategy. If I can become like them, if they see me as one of them, they won't kill me. This is the heart of the paradox. The person who is the source of your terror also becomes your only hope for survival. You begin to empathize with their cause, adopt their grievances, and see the outside world, especially the police, as a mutual threat. The police trying to rescue you are seen not as saviors, but as a danger that could get everyone, including you, killed. This was the psychological crucible in which Patty Hearst found herself. She was isolated, terrified, and relentlessly indoctrinated. She was told her fiancé, Stephen Weed, had abandoned her, that her parents' efforts to free her were insincere, and that the FBI was a murderous organization that would rather see her dead than allow the SLA to succeed. Every day, the lines blurred. The people who had brutalized her were also the people who fed her. The people who threatened to kill her were also the people who engaged her in long, intense political discussions, treating her, perhaps for the first time in her sheltered life, as an intellectual equal. After weeks in the darkness of the closet, machine-gun-toting made her an offer. He told her she could be released or she could join them and fight. Given the psychological state she was in, was it truly a choice? She was being asked to choose between a world she had been taught to despise and whose representatives had failed to save her, and a new family that, for all its brutality, had offered her a place and a purpose. On April 3, 1974, 60 days after a new communiqué was sent to the media. It contained a shocking photograph and an audio tape that would cement her place in history. The photograph was electrifying. A thin, defiant-looking Patty Hearst stood in front of the SLA's seven-headed cobra flag. She wore combat-style clothing and brandished a sawed-off M1 carbine. She looked less like a victim and more like a soldier. The accompanying audio tape was even more stunning. Her voice was no longer the flat monotone of a hostage reading a script. It was strong, passionate, and filled with revolutionary fervor. She announced that she had adopted the name Tania after a comrade of the famous revolutionary Che Guevara. She denounced her former life, her fiancé, and her Pighurst parents. And then came the words that seared themselves into the public mind. "I have chosen to stay and fight." She declared her former self, Patty, to be dead, and proclaimed her new identity as a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army. To a bewildered public, it was an inexplicable transformation. How could an heiress, a symbol of American privilege, become a gun-toting radical in just 2 months? To her family, it was proof that their daughter had been broken, brainwashed by her captors. To the FBI and much of the public, she was now a willing participant, a criminal who had crossed the line from victim to perpetrator. The debate that began that day has never truly ended. Was this a genuine conversion, the result of a political awakening combined with the intense psychological pressure of captivity, or was it the ultimate act of survival, a desperate performance by a young woman who believed that playing the part of a revolutionary was the only way to stay alive? The SLA, for their part, needed to prove that their new recruit was genuine. They needed to show the world that Tania was not just a mouthpiece, but a combatant. And so, just 12 days after her announcement, they chose a target, the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. On the morning of April 15, 1974, 4 members of the SLA, armed with semi-automatic rifles, stormed the Sunset District branch of the Hibernia Bank. The robbery was chaotic and violent. One of the robbers fired a burst from their weapon into the ceiling, showering the terrified customers and employees with plaster dust. Another shot and wounded a bystander outside. But it was the image from the bank's security camera that would become iconic. There, in the center of the frame, was Tania, Patty Hearst. She was holding a carbine, shouting orders at the bank customers, her face a mask of cold determination. The footage was broadcast on every news channel in the country. It was grainy, black and white, and utterly damning. For millions of Americans, this was the irrefutable proof. This was not a hostage. This was a bank robber. The Hibernia bank robbery transformed the Patty Hearst case from a kidnapping into a nationwide manhunt. The FBI, which had been treating her primarily as a victim, now issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of armed robbery. She was officially a fugitive. The members of the SLA, including their new celebrity recruit, went deeper underground. They fled San Francisco and relocated to a safe house in Los Angeles. During this time on the run, Patty, or Tania, seemed to drift further into her new identity. She would later claim she was still a prisoner, constantly watched by the others, particularly by the volatile William and Emily Heiress. She alleged that she was subjected to constant drills, weapons training, and ongoing political indoctrination. She participated in another crime, a botched robbery of a sporting goods store where a shootout erupted, forcing the group to flee. Her defenders would argue these actions were still committed under duress. But to the authorities, each new act cemented her status as a committed revolutionary terrorist. The end for the core leadership of the SLA came on May 17, 1974, in a quiet residential neighborhood in south-central Los Angeles. An anonymous tip led hundreds of LAPD officers and FBI agents to a small, yellow stucco house at 1466 East 54th Street. Inside were 6 members of the SLA, including their leader, Shinku DeFries. Patty Hearst and the Harrises were not there. They had left earlier and were watching the events unfold on a television in a motel room near Disneyland. The police surrounded the house and demanded the occupants surrender. The SLA responded with a furious barrage of automatic weapons fire. For the next 2 hours, the nation watched live on television as one of the most intense shootouts in American history took place. The small house was riddled with thousands of bullets. The police fired tear gas canisters into the building, which ignited a massive fire. The house was quickly engulfed in flames. When it was over, all 6 SLA members inside, including Shinku, Nancy Ling Perry, and Angela. The fiery demise of its leader and core members should have been the end of the Symbionese Liberation Army. But it wasn't. For the next 16 months, Patty Hearst, along with William and Emily Heiress and a few new recruits, remained on the run, a bizarre and dysfunctional remnant of a failed revolution. They crisscrossed the country, moving from Pennsylvania back to Sacramento, then to San Francisco. They were fugitives, but they were also still attempting to be revolutionaries. They bombed police cars, and in April of 1975, they committed another bank robbery, this time at the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, California. During this robbery, a 42-year-old mother of 4 named Myrna Opsahl, who was depositing church receipts, was shot and killed. Though Patty Hearst was the driver of the getaway car and did not fire the fatal shot, which was fired by Emily Heiress, she was now tied to a capital murder. The stakes had been raised from armed robbery to homicide. The image of the brainwashed heiress was becoming harder and harder to maintain. She was, in the eyes of the law. Her life as a fugitive finally came to an end on September 18, 1975. Acting on a tip, FBI agents surrounded a second-floor apartment in San Francisco's Outer Mission District. This time, there was no shootout. Patty Hearst and her SLA comrade Wendy Yoshimura surrendered without a fight. When she was arrested, the 19-year-old girl who had been kidnapped from her Berkeley apartment was gone. In her place was a 21-year-old woman who, when asked to state her occupation for the booking form, replied, "Urban guerrilla." A photograph taken shortly after her arrest shows her raising a clenched fist in a gesture of revolutionary defiance. The long, strange journey of Tania was over. The fight for the soul of Patty Hearst was about to begin, and the battlefield would be a federal courtroom. The trial of Patty Hearst, which began in January 1976, was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle, a trial of the tumultuous decade itself. It pitted the counterculture against the establishment, radical politics against the rule of law, and a daughter against her family's legacy. At the center of it all was the one question that had captivated the country for nearly 2 years. Was she a victim or a villain? The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney James Browning, Jr., presented a straightforward case. They argued that Patty Hearst was a willing participant in the SLA's crimes. They had the Hibernia Bank surveillance footage, her own recorded statements pledging allegiance to the SLA, and the testimony of witnesses who would say she appeared calm and in control during the robberies. They would portray her as a privileged young woman who, bored with her life, found purpose and excitement in radical politics, and chose to become a revolutionary. Her Tania persona, they argued, was not a mask but her true self. The defense, led by the legendary and famously aggressive attorney F. Lee Bailey, had a monumental task. They had to convince a jury that every criminal act Patty committed after her kidnapping was not of her own free will. Their entire case rested on a single, powerful, and at the time still scientifically ambiguous concept: brainwashing. Bailey would argue that Patty was a victim of coercive persuasion, a classic case of what was just beginning to be called Stockholm Syndrome. He planned to put her on the stand to tell her own story of the 57 days in the closet, the constant fear, the relentless indoctrination, and the sexual abuse she endured at the hands of Shinku de Vries and another male member. Her testimony would be the heart of the defense. She would describe how her identity was systematically erased and replaced with that of Tania, not out of political conviction, but out of a primal need to survive. To support this claim, Bailey assembled a team of prominent psychiatrists: Dr. Robert J. Lifton, an expert on thought reform, who had studied American prisoners of war from the Korean War, testified that Hearst was a classic example of a coerced victim. He compared the SLA's methods to the brainwashing techniques used by totalitarian regimes. Dr. Louis Jolyon West, a UCLA psychiatrist, would testify that Hearst was in a state of terror with intermittent fear of annihilation. He diagnosed her with a traumatic neurosis and stated that her adoption of the Tania persona was a life-saving maneuver by a psyche on the verge of collapse. The defense painted a portrait of a young woman so psychologically shattered that she was incapable of forming criminal intent. Her actions, they argued, were the actions of a puppet, not a person. The prosecution countered with its own team of psychiatric experts. They brought in Dr. Joel Fort and Dr. Harry Kozel, who, after examining Hearst, concluded that she was not brainwashed, but was a willing participant. They pointed to her high IQ and strong-willed personality as evidence that she was not easily manipulated. They argued that she was a rebel in search of a cause, and that the SLA provided her with one. Dr. Kozel famously testified that she was a queen within the SLA, not a pawn. The prosecution's most powerful weapon, however, was Patty's own behavior. They played the Tania tapes with her strong, defiant voice. They showed the Hibernia Bank photos, and they cross-examined Patty herself for days. On the stand, she appeared sullen, evasive, and at times unconvincing. She claimed to not remember large portions of her time with the SLA, citing the trauma. She frequently pleaded the Fifth Amendment, which to the jury looked like an admission of guilt. The image she projected was not that of a fragile, broken victim, but that of a defiant criminal who refused. F. Lee Bailey's courtroom strategy was also widely criticized. His abrasive style may have alienated the jury, but perhaps the biggest blow to the defense came from the defendant herself. The transformation from Patty to Tania had been so complete that it was difficult for her to revert back. Her revolutionary rhetoric had been too convincing, her clenched fist salute too defiant. She had played the part of Tania so well that she had convinced not just the world, but perhaps even a part of herself. The jury was left to weigh two competing realities. One was the story of a terrified girl in a closet, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The other was the image of a woman holding a gun in a bank, shouting orders, and later raising a fist in solidarity with her cause. On March 20th, 1976, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Patty Hearst guilty of armed bank robbery. They rejected the brainwashing defense. The journey that began with a violent abduction ended with a federal conviction. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The verdict was a stunning blow to the Hearst family and a decisive moment in the public understanding of psychology and the law. It suggested that there were limits to how far the concept of victimhood could be stretched. In the eyes of the jury, no amount of psychological coercion could absolve a person of responsibility for their actions, especially when those actions included armed robbery and participation in a group that had taken a life. The verdict affirmed a belief in free will, in the idea that even under the most extreme pressure, an individual still retains the capacity to choose right from wrong. Patty Hearst served 22 months of her sentence. Her case continued to be a cause célèbre, attracting support from a wide range of public figures who believed she was a victim who had been unjustly punished. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, and she was released from prison. For years, she lived a quiet life, marrying her former bodyguard, raising a family, and trying to escape the shadow of Tania. But the story was not quite over. In 2001, on his last day in office, President Bill Clinton granted her a full presidential pardon, legally wiping her slate clean. The pardon was controversial, seen by some as a final act of justice for a woman who had suffered enough, and by others as a final act of privilege for an heiress who had literally gotten away with murder. The debate over her culpability, her identity, and the very nature of her experience continues to this day. So we return to our central question, to the anatomy of this case. What does the saga of Patty Hearst truly teach us about Stockholm Syndrome? It teaches us, first and foremost, that the human mind is profoundly malleable under conditions of extreme stress. It shows that our identities, which we often think of as fixed and stable, can be deconstructed and rebuilt under the right, or rather the wrong, set of circumstances. The 57 days in the closet were a powerful demonstration of how isolation, fear, and relentless indoctrination can warp perception and rewrite a person's reality. Patty Hearst's experience, as described by the defense, provides a textbook, albeit extreme illustration of the psychological mechanisms, the threat to survival, the small kindnesses, the total isolation that can lead to capture bonding. But the case also serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the limits of that diagnosis, especially in a court of law. The concept of Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological description, not a legal defense. The law, for the most part, is built on a foundation of individual responsibility. The legal system struggled and ultimately failed to find a place for a defendant who was simultaneously a victim of a horrific crime and a perpetrator of other, equally serious crimes. Where does victimization end and culpability begin? Can a person be both a puppet and a puppeteer? The Hearst trial provided no easy answers. Her guilt or innocence in the court of public opinion remains as divided today as it was in 1976. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this case is the name Tania. It has become a cultural shorthand for the radical, the revolutionary, the woman who sheds her identity to join the enemy. But that simple narrative obscures the terrifying complexity of what happened to Patty Hearst. She was not simply a girl who was kidnapped. She was a person who was unmade. The debate over whether she was brainwashed or a willing convert misses a more disturbing third possibility, that she was both, that in the crucible of captivity, the line between performance and belief, between survival and conversion, simply dissolved. She may have started playing the part of Tania to stay alive, but after months of living that role, of speaking those words, of holding that gun, the part may have consumed the player. The story of Patty Hearst is not a simple story of good versus evil. of a victim versus a villain. It is a story about the gray, murky, terrifying space in between. It forces us to confront the unsettling reality that under enough pressure, the person we are, the beliefs we hold, the very essence of ourself, might be far more fragile than we would ever care to admit. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.